Cool. So, hello. Again, I'm Cassie with Plant Chicago. I am the education manager, and I'm super excited to talk to you all about composting with worms today. So Plant Chicago, we are a super small nonprofit in the back of the yards. We're located in an old firehouse, and our mission is to cultivate local circular economies. So basically within a circular economy, we try to reuse as much waste as possible. And it's opposed to a linear form of economy where you're taking something from the environment, you create a product, and that product's designed for one-time use, then you throw it away. So in the circular economy, all of those materials are reused in some type of creative way. And our programs are all based around that mission. One of which is our K through 12 education program. That's what I run. And typically we do this in person with about 30 students each. And we do closed loop labs, which are hands-on workshops that are somehow involved with reusing some type of waste. So we do a closed loop lab around worm composting. We also do open source research where we work with interns, volunteers, and businesses to figure out different creative ways to reuse waste within businesses. And we publish that on our website. So you can check that out at plantchicago.org. And then we also do small business support. We have a small business circular economy leaders network of about 15 small businesses, all from the southwest side of Chicago, focused on figuring out ways that they can collaborate and reuse each other's waste products and make their businesses more sustainable. So I'm just going to jump right into it because I got a lot of slides, you guys, and we're going to talk about compost. And I think this is a perfect day to talk about compost, Earth Day. And composting is really like the ultimate form of recycling that happens in nature. Compost is decayed organic matter, high in nutrients that can be used as fertilizer for both indoor and outdoor plants. It can be a mixture of organic matter, such as manure and or leftover food that's been left around to break down and decompose. So there's a bunch of different ways to compost, but for the focus of today, we are going to talk about worm composting. Whoops, here we go. Let's talk about benefits of composting. So some benefits include that it retains more water. So when you mix compost in with your regular soil, you don't need to water it as frequently. It reduces soil erosion, helps with carbon sequestration. It reduces the need for synthetic fertilizers, and it also reduces landfill waste. So that's mainly what we're trying to promote today, is reusing your own food scraps at home, especially during this time of the coronavirus where we're all at home, we're all eating a lot more, cooking a lot more. This is a really cool way that you can reduce your own food scraps, have worms who can then produce waste in the form of vermicompost. Then you can use that as fertilizer for your plants. So in order for this to function, right, we need to have these decomposers, and decomposers are super important in landfills, but they're really important out in ecosystems and soil as well. So today we are going to talk a little bit about the help that they do in composting. We've got fungi, microbes and bacteria, and then finally worms, which are the superstars of today, and why vermicompost. Worm castings and vermicompost can be added to indoor and outdoor plants in the form of rich plant food. It reduces food waste at home that would normally end up in a landfill or an incinerator. Plus, they make really great pets. So this is an example of what one of our closed loop labs would look like. We usually make a worm composting bin with a classroom, and then they take that back to their school, and they're able to feed those worms and create their own worm compost, which they can then use in their gardens or indoor plants in their classroom. So what is vermicompost? It is a mixture of partially decomposed organic waste, bedding, worm castings, which is basically the worm poop, worms, cocoons, and other organisms. Typically, you use red wiggler worms in a worm composting bin, and that's mainly because they like to stay on the top layer of soil. If you were to work with something like earthworms or a different type of worm, they require a different environment to thrive, and earthworms need to go deep into the earth. So they would not be happy being in a regular little worm composting bin like we're going to show you today. And worm castings is the worm poop, which is basically vermicompost that can be used as a very high and nutrient-rich form of compost. So now we're going to talk specifically about the red wiggler worm. So worm anatomy, there is a front and a back of a worm. I'm going to try to get my little laser pointer out here. Oh my gosh. Okay. So this is the front of the worm, or the anterior, and the back of the worm, or posterior, is over here. The way that you can tell that you're looking at the front of the worm is by the location of the clitellum, which is this bulbous looking gland right here. And that is actually their reproductive organ. And I'm going to talk all about worm reproduction in my next 2 slides. So I'll get to that in a second. But at the front here, you have the mouth. Worms don't have eyes or really a face, but they are sensitive to light, so that's how they move around. They also use this thing called a prostomium to help them poke around in the soil and move and find their food. And it's basically like a flap that they can open and close, and that's how they bring food and soil in through their system. They have a digestive tract that runs all through their body like so, and it works like a gizzard, and they have beneficial microbes and bacteria that live in that gizzard to help them break down food waste. They also have setae, which are little hairs, and on each one of the segments, which are just the little parts of the worm, they have up to 8 hairs. And these are really tiny little hairs that you can't see with your eyes, but they help the worm to move throughout the soil, and they help them to like grab onto stuff. Then, of course, you got the anus here, which is where the worm castings, or that vermicompost, comes out of in the form of very rich, beautiful compost. So I'm going to talk all about worm reproduction. Red worms are hermaphrodites, so that means that they have the reproductive organs of both male and female. So unlike other worms, they actually do need another worm in order to reproduce. Other types of worms, like earthworms, can reproduce without another worm. And in order for them to reproduce, they use this bulbous gland, also known as the clitellum, and also known as the worm band-aid, around the worm's body, which contains the worm's reproductive organs. When the worms are ready to reproduce, the clitellum becomes visible and turns orange. So this is my 10-step process of worm reproduction. Basically, the worms join together at their clitellums and create a ring of mucus. And after a few hours, they separate. Through that process, they exchange their genetic material, and each worm deposits eggs into a cocoon that's wrapped around their body at that weird clitellum thing in this mucousy ring. Then the worm wiggles out of the cocoon, almost like taking off a sweatshirt. So they wiggle out and they seal the cocoon. And the cocoons are typically deposited near the surface of the bedding. That's where worms like to mate as well, in kind of like the newspapery surface of the bedding, which I'll get into that in a little bit. The cocoon hardens, and then that keeps the worm safe inside. They're actually super hardy inside of there, and they can last up to a year and withstand below freezing temperatures. So oftentimes, if your worm bin is in danger for whatever reason, maybe it's too hot or too cold, or there's other types of creatures living in there, or mold, they'll actually produce a bunch of these cocoons to try to save their population even after they die, because it can last for a long time and then potentially survive. So the worms will only emerge from their cocoon if the conditions are right. And if they are right, that's usually within 2 to 3 weeks. And if they're not right, it can last up to a year. So in each one of these cocoons, which I'll show you a picture of this in a second, between 3 to 20 baby worms can emerge. Usually it's about 3 to 5, but sometimes if you're really lucky and you've got like a really healthy batch of worms, you could have up to 20 baby worms emerge from a cocoon. And then those baby worms, after 2 to 3 months, will be old enough to reproduce themselves, and then that process starts all over again. And a typical red wiggler worm in captivity or in a worm composting bin can live up to 2 years. So here are some signs that your population is growing. Here's a worm with that clitellum that we're talking about. And again, when they rub those things together and create this mucus, then they pop out this cocoon. And within that cocoon, up to 20 baby worms can emerge, but usually it's around 3 to 5. And this is what a little baby worm looks like. I couldn't find an amazing picture of a baby worm, and I couldn't take one because my cell phone just was not having it. But they're these tiny little creatures that are kind of clearish gray, white, and then they get a little bit more colorful like this worm as they get older. So this is what they look like when they are babies. So let's talk a little bit about what worms can eat. So they can eat a bunch of different types of food scraps like potato peelings, carrots, lettuce, cabbage, celery, apple peelings. We've got banana peels, orange rinds, grapefruit, bread, cornmeal, oatmeal, eggshells. If you feed them eggshells, you want to rinse out the eggshell before you give it to them, because if it has like actual egg in it, it might get mold growing in your system. Coffee grounds, coffee filters, if they're not bleached, so brown coffee filters. Tea bags, you want to make sure that you don't have the little staple in there when you're feeding it to your worms. Some don't have those at all, but just be careful when you're adding tea bags. Berries, greens, dead leaves, hair, dust, newspaper, brown paper towels, and brown bags. And then what can't worms eat? These are my fun graphics. So you don't want to feed them any type of meat, cheese, or dairy. We've got salad dressing on there, mayo, spicy foods. Of course, no plastics, metals, or glass. Soap, greasy foods, glossy paper. That's especially something you should note when using newspaper as bedding. You want to make sure that there's no glossy ads in there or coupons or anything like that. You want to have just regular newspaper. And most newspapers actually use a soy-based ink, so you're able to use that as bedding. You don't want any oils, processed foods, lemons, limes, onions, garlic, yard trimmings that have been used with treated with pesticides, or pineapple. So really nothing very acidic. You don't want to put meat, fish, cheese, dairy in there, because that could attract bacteria and mold and things like that you don't want to have in your system. Or like maggots or different things like that, different decomposers. If other creatures start to thrive in your worm composting bin, they'll start to eat up the food that your worms would normally live off of. And then that could actually kill your population. You don't want to put anything processed in there, because they won't be able to work through that with their digestive systems. And of course, nothing that's not biodegradable. So how to make your own bin in your home or your classroom. So first you want to gather your supplies. You're going to want to look for something like this. This is a good starter. A 10-gallon opaque storage tote is great. You can get those at just like Target or Home Depot or wherever. Some people just have it kind of like hanging around their house too, but you want to make sure that it's opaque. Because if it's translucent, like I said before, worms are sensitive to light. So you want to make sure that light can't get into that. You want to have some type of bedding, which I'll go over some more bedding options, like newspaper. You want to have a handful of soil because there's going to be bacteria and microbes in that soil that help your worms to digest, because they have these microbial systems. And in order for them to digest stuff, they need to have microbes, kind of like us. You want to have at least 1 pound of red wigglers per 10 gallons of your storage tote. And then you want to use a 3/16 inch bit to drill your holes in your lid. So where can you source these materials? The bedding, newspaper you can use, cardboard, egg cartons, brown paper towels, bags, dead leaves. You don't want to use too many of those, but you could use that in with your regular newspaper. The bin you could get at Home Depot, Lowe's, Target. You may even have one just laying around your home. The worms themselves, Nature's Little Recyclers is a former composting worm composting farm that since closed down, but you can still actually find them on the internet, which is kind of interesting. So I'm not quite sure what's going on with that, but you can still source them. Uncle Jim's Worm Farm and Buckeye Organics are just a few, but if you search red wiggler worms online, you can purchase some worms there during this time. There are some like pickup locations as well, but wouldn't really make sense right now probably. And then of course the small amount of soil you can get from your garden or an existing worm bin. You can also get it from the store. It's important to have some of those microbes already in the soil and bedding for the worms to survive. So this is an example of how the holes should be spaced when you drill the holes. So you want to drill a bunch of holes, and I'll show you on my worm bin as well. And then you assemble your bin. So I'm going to actually show you my bin in a second and explain some more things about it. But before we do that, I need to explain how to harvest your compost. So after a couple of months of your worms working in your composting bin, you'll start to see this compost, which looks like this. And I'll show you this when I stop screen sharing in a second, but it basically looks like soil. And so you'll want to harvest that because if they're around too much of their own waste, that's toxic for them. So you want to harvest it periodically. A way to do that is the lighted pile method. So you can lay down a tarp or a heavy plastic sheet on the floor or on a table or outside, dump the contents of your worm bin out, divide it into small piles, and then shine some light on it. You could put a flashlight or a lamp or even the sun. I did that in my house the other day where I just put the compost out. Sun was shining in the window. The worms are sensitive to light, so they'll naturally go down. And then you can just skim the compost off the top and add the worms back into your bin. Worms are sensitive to light, so if they're in light for over 1 hour, they could become paralyzed. So make sure that you're getting your worms back into your bin as quickly as possible. There's also the divide and sort method, which is stop feeding your worms for 2 weeks, move all of your old bedding to one side of the bin, and then add fresh bedding and food on the other side. The worms will naturally migrate to the fresh bedding and the food. And then on the other side, you can harvest your compost. And then the third method is just a live and let die method, which is stop feeding the worms, worms will die, and then you harvest your worm compost. I've seen this a lot with teachers who forget that they have worms over the summer, or maybe they forget their, worms at school, or something happens where you forget that you're doing it. And you'll actually end up with like a beautiful bin filled with compost. You won't have any worms anymore, but you will have compost. So that's kind of the light at the end of the tunnel there. So before I show you my bin, got to promote my stuff. Plant Chicago's doing a virtual science fair. If you're interested in that, you can go to plantchicago.org to submit your science fair project. It could be a DIY project, an experiment, or a circular economy challenge where you're reusing something. And that ends May 15th. We're also doing all these fun virtual workshops, kind of like this one. Tomorrow we're doing one on waste audits where we sort through our trash together. And then this Saturday, we're doing one on container gardening and another on DIY herbal remedies for the immune system. So if people are interested in any of those workshops, you can go to www.plantchicago.org. And now I'm going to show you my worm bin. All right, so you guys see me okay still? Okay, I'm just going to show you my worm bin. So there are a few different things that you can use as bedding if you're just starting out. This is just a brown paper towel. You could also use some cardboard like so. And then you can use newspaper. When you're making your bedding, you want to take the newspaper at the fold like this and then just cut it into strips. So you can just do it like so, or you can use scissors if you want to, but I think this is kind of weirdly therapeutic. And then you would just add that into your worm bin, which I have right here. So this is my beautiful worm bin. You can see the holes on the top. And in here, we have a bunch of newspaper, and you want to make sure that it's wet. It's pretty moist, but it's not completely dripping wet. And then inside here, you can see we've got a bunch of worms. So in here, they are in some of their own, the black stuff that you see is the worm compost. So that's the good stuff that you can take and harvest and add into your regular soil, either in a container outside or inside in your regular indoor plants. I recently had a mite infestation in my worm bin, which I can talk about, but they were just too many of them, so I actually had to harvest all of mine and start again. And it's going really well now. So what I did was I added all of this and then added in some water, made sure that it was nice and moist but not dripping wet, and then transferred my worms over. And then I'm going to feed them now too. So here's my delicious worm food. So I've got some coffee grounds, I've got some eggshells, a little bit of cilantro, and strawberries, and an avocado rind or a skin. And then when you feed them, you want to just move the bedding over to one side and then sprinkle it in. And they like it when you crumple everything up and cut everything up as much as you can because they'll go through it faster. Eggshells, you really don't want to put too many in there because it's really hard and it's hard for them to get through. But things like avocado skins, mango skins, banana peels, stuff like that, they really like that because there's like a little bit of mush in it. And then they can lay their cocoons in the mush. So they're looking for that mushy stuff. Let's see. Now we can do some questions. I know there's a bunch of questions on here.
Awesome. Thanks, Cassie. So,
thanks, Cassie.
Yes, you're welcome.
So it looks like a good question we had towards the beginning that I think you addressed, but maybe we can address again is, where's the best place to get worms?
Where's the best place to get worms? Yes, so I had on there one of the slides. Nature's Little Recyclers, like I said, that's a worm composting farm that is no longer around, but they have a lot of their worms still available. So if you search them online, you can find their worms per pound, which is pretty wild. I'm not quite sure how they're still doing that, but they're still selling worms. And then there were two other links in there. I think there was one called Jim's Worm Farm, and then another one called Buckeye Organics. I couldn't find a lot of, really Nature's Little Recyclers was like my local Chicago worm source. So when that went out, I was very, very sad. So I've heard there are some like local places like bait shops and things like that, but I can't name any specifically, but you could search like local Chicago bait shops and you ask for red wiggler worms there.
I'm pretty sure the Nature Museum uses Nature's Little Recyclers still.
Right, I know. I don't know how they're still doing it, but you can still order it, and I've got their phone number and stuff too, so they're still sourcing worms, but they're not composting anymore. Maybe they just have a lot of worms.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Nature Museum has ordered from Nature's Little Recyclers. We also ordered from Uncle Jim's Worm Farm for our last group of C3 leaders, and they were super friendly and very easy to work with. They will ship you your worms. They're not local to Chicago, but it went well.
Cool.
Another good question we had from Miranda was, how do you start this process outside? Like, can you make your bin and put it outside?
You can do it outside. I would recommend using something like a tumbler, though, instead of a bin like this. Mainly because they're going to do a little bit better in the winter, and know that your worms aren't going to be very active in the winter. They'll probably lay a whole bunch of cocoons as it gets colder, and then they're not going to be actively composting that much throughout those colder months. But they will be active once it gets nicer outside. They do huddle together. Like if you have a larger tumbler, they'll huddle together and like be in this big squishy mess. So there will be worms still throughout the winter, but if you just have a 10-gallon tote like this, you don't want to put that outside because they will just straight up die.
Nice. Okay.
Another good question for bins is, can we use shredded office paper instead of newspaper at the very beginning?
That is a very good question. You do not want to do that, mainly because it's bleached and it has chemicals in it. So you don't want to use any bleached papers like white regular printer paper or bleached coffee filters, for example. You want to stick to newspaper because it's recycled and it's processed and has soy ink on it, so you can use that. Or any type of like brown paper bag or brown paper towel. So here's my brown paper. I brought all my props. I got to show you guys my props. Oh, and this is my finished worm compost that I just kind of put into this jar. But you can see it's just regular soil. It's like very rich, beautiful compost. So, and you can also see that the eggshells don't break down that well. So don't feed your worms too many eggshells. Otherwise, you'll have to sift through your compost.
Awesome. Well, I think that sounds like all of the questions we have, and it's 3:30 and we promised it was going to be a short webinar. Thank you so much, Cassie, for joining us today. Thank all of you for tuning in today. You can find more information about Plant Chicago and their upcoming events on their website. I believe we put it in the chat. It's plantchicago.org. You can also stay connected to the C3 community and find information about our upcoming trainings and other volunteer opportunities by signing up for our monthly newsletter. You can also stay connected to what's happening at the Nature Museum by signing up for our new daily newsletter. And we'll share links to all of these in the chat window. You can also find the Chicago Conservation Corps and the Nature Museum on social media. And next week, we're having another C3 webinar with Dr. Rachel from UIC Freshwater Labs about freshwater in the time of COVID-19. So I hope you all have a wonderful Earth Day, and thank you again for tuning in. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.